In addition to pensions, we thought Brea First could serve a role in facilitating discussion on other issues of importance for the city. And term limits has definitely come up as a big issue in the city in recent months, and it's been an issue off and on for years. So we have our 4 panelists, and I left our biography over here, so let me grab that. So from near to far, we have Supervisor Shawn Nelson, who represents the 4th District on the County Board of Supervisors. He includes Brea, among other cities. He previously served on the Fullerton City Council, and he is an attorney by profession. Supervisor Nelson was a managing partner in the Santa Ana law firm Rizzio and Nelson. Supervisor Nelson serves on the Orange County Transportation Authority Board, the MetroLink Board, and among others, the South Coast Air Quality Management District Board. He's involved in the Elks, in the Bar Association, in his church, and family life, including local sports. Okay, Supervisor Nelson. Second, we have here Bruce Whitaker, who's a current member of the Fullerton City Council. He served as the director he serves as a director on the Orange County Water District. He served on the Santa Ana River Flood Protection Agency and Water Advisory Committee of Orange County. He also serves on the Orange County Bond Oversight Board and has been involved in city and county issues for over 2 decades. Councilman Whitaker was a proponent of term limits for the Orange County Board of Supervisors back when they were first introduced. And for other background, in case you haven't heard, Supervisor Nelson has a proposal to reform term limits at the county level. So we will hear more about both tonight. John Koos is the president. John Koos is the president of Core Development Services, a 60-employee company that provides real estate and engineering services to wireless companies like Verizon and AT&T, and he's also president of Tronco, sorry, I can't read my own writing. Koos Enterprises, a land use and economic development consulting firm. He's involved locally in the Rotary and the Chamber of Commerce. We have Director Heidi Gallegos here. He is also involved in Scouts and has served for 2 terms on the Brea Planning Commission, as well as 2 prior on the Anaheim City Planning Commission. So John Koos. And John has been a proponent of term limits. He wrote an article for the Brea Matters blog about this, I think it was a couple months ago, roughly. I think we have Christie and Russell here at the end, and she's been a resident for her whole life. Her family came here in 1921. The typical Brea story. Came here with relation to the oil industry. As you know, Brea roughly means tar. So I always love the La Brea tar pits are the tar pits. But or Los Angeles Angels or the Angels. Anyway, Christie's father, you may have heard of Chuck Russell, was on the Brea City Council from 1955 to 1958, and she has spoken and written in opposition to the current discussion about term limits. So, Christie Russell. So a little background, we'll do about, speakers will each go for up to 10 minutes, and a lot of them are probably going to speak for about 5 or 6 minutes. We'll go from the far side to the near side, since we introduced from the near to the far. And then from there we'll open it up to discussion, to Q&A. And so you all know we're on videotape here, so you've been warned. This should be a good discussion, and I know plenty of people wanted to be here but couldn't for a variety of reasons, so the video option will let people catch up if they weren't able to be here. So with that, Christie, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Chris. Before I begin, I just want to say that for all the numbers and for you number people, I have some background sources here that after are in the discussion, if you want to see the numbers of how I came up with what I did, I have the resources here. So, well, we'll just get to it since you've already given my introduction. I came to this subject thanks to Rick Clark's blog, Brea Matters. I watched the council meeting and became passionately enraged toward the issue. I believe that it is up to the citizens of Brea to say when it is time for a council member to leave, not an arbitrary and certainly not the draconian initiative that Steve Vargas has set in motion. I became passionate when I saw that Mr. Vargas, who had agreed during the council member meeting for the staff of the city of Brea to see if term limits were needed and the best way to get the citizens involved. Then he turned around and filed the initiative before the next council meeting, totally going against his word and costing the citizens of Brea $5,900 in wasted city staff time as they have been tasked to look into the matter. So let's get to the facts of the city of Brea. For the last 99 years, from 1917 to the present, the following is true. In the past 99 years, four people have served terms over 12 years. That's approximately 4%. Over the same 99 years, 5 people served 3 terms of 12 years. 4 people, 5 people. 8 people served 9 to 11 years, and then we had 61 members serve 8 years or less in the last 99 years. We're talking about 8 people in 99 years. Are we really going to spend the money? We've already spent $5,900 for term limits. What does it mean? It means Brea does not need term limits. We have on our city council right now 3 council members with 2 years of current experience, 1 with 4 years of experience, and 1 with 20 years of experience, and thank God for him. With the level of inexperience on the council, it is imperative to have at least 1 council member with long-term experience. It's essential for maintaining continuity of the city's relationship to the staff, especially to the other cities, the region, the county, the state, and even federal government agencies. So let's get the elephant in the room exposed. Mr. Vargas brought up the issue during his first term. Data for the time clearly indicates no need for term limits. Again, thank God for continuity. And the numerous failed attempts to regain a seat on council, not once were term limits a campaign issue for Mr. Vargas. There is nothing to suggest this has been a long-standing, continued quest, other than he brought them up during his first term and now again has brought them up during his term. 5 incumbents have been defeated in the last 24 years. Clarice Blamer, Bernie Dunlap, Glenn Parker, Steve Vargas, and Brett Murdoch. The citizens of Brea seem to be doing a pretty good job without relying on term limits. I've heard it said that some people don't want to run against a long-term incumbent, and in particular, Marty, or previously Roy. I've heard also the reason they didn't want to run against them was their belief that they were doing a pretty good job. If that is true, there would still have been at least 4 positions open over the 4 years. I'm sorry, but who does that really make sense to? There are either 2 incumbents or 3 incumbents running for election every 2 years. A local citizen on her own sent an email questionnaire to senior elected officials from a number of cities. If there is a need during the discussion, I can summarize their experiences. But I am keeping this presentation to the facts regarding the city of Brea. So to wrap it up, the facts of the last 99 years show that term limits are not needed. More importantly, Steve's version, 2 terms or an appointment and a term, and then out for life, is not helpful, but could be extremely detrimental to the citizens of Brea. If you are a business person, you are basically paying for the privilege of being a council member. The $680 stipend does not cover loss of wages when serving during the day or the loss of business opportunity during council service. These people are volunteers. They don't get a pension. They serve. They serve because they want to. Thank God for that. In these days of economic uncertainty, it is harder and harder to find people who are qualified and who want to not only give of their time, but are able to give their time to an often ungrateful constituency. Let's not try to fix what isn't broken and cause more collateral damage in the process, like the state of California. In finishing, I would like to share a quote written almost 200 years ago by philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. There are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to accept what is true. I choose not to be fooled because I have the facts. Here is what is true. Term limits in Brea are not needed. Thank you.
First, I must apologize. I left my glasses in the car, so you'll have to bear with me. So, thank you for that. Thanks for inviting me. Brea First.
Take a shot.
Maybe.
Bifocals, so if it help at all.
No, it's worse. Okay. I get it. All right. Thank you. I'd like to start my comments by going way back in time to the founding of our country. Thomas Jefferson argued for term limits in order to, quote, prevent every danger which might arise to America by continuing too long in office. A Jefferson contemporary and delegate to the Constitutional Convention, George Mason, stated, quote, nothing is so essential to the preservation of Republican government as periodic rotation. When quoting the founders, I admit that given the disparate views of the individuals, one can find a quote in support or opposition on nearly any matter of governance. Yet, it is clear there was an overriding principle that nearly all founders believed in practice, that serving in political office was a temporary thing. That they would serve their country, then go back to farming or practicing law or banking or whatever their vocation was. George Washington set the standard by serving 2 terms as president. Even Supreme Court justices, though appointed for life, sometimes resigned to pursue other activities, such as Chief Justice John Jay. The lack of term limits in the Constitution, therefore, was probably not an urgent matter to be addressed, since the notion of decades-long tenures in legislatures was a foreign and even shameful concept. That brings us to Brea. In 1998, Roy Moore and Steve Vargas ran on an 8 is enough platform. In 2000 and 2002, both argued for term limits to be placed on the ballot. The primary argument against from the council majority was it wasn't a problem that needed solving, to Ms. Russell's point, because hardly anyone in Brea's 85-year history had sought more than a second term. Sound familiar? The Founding Fathers didn't address it either because it wasn't common practice then either. Since the 2002 decision to not address term limits, Brea has seen 3 council members serve 3, 4, and 5 consecutive terms. So while it wasn't arguably a problem that needed solving then, the last 15 years has demonstrated that the argument is no longer valid. That leaves the question of whether one simply believes in the notion of term limits or not. Incumbent advantage is quite clear. Yes, people will point to incumbents losing re-election. That does happen. Yet incumbents enjoy a startling re-election rate. As I pointed out in a recent article in Brea Matters, according to PolitiFact, Congress had an 11% approval rating while 96% of incumbents still won re-election in 2014. Part of the reason is surely due to the fact that incumbents have more donor resources and therefore can spend a lot of money on getting reelected. Special interests tend to give to candidates that have a good statistical chance of still being in office after election. A 96% re-election rate is a pretty good bet. Why are term limits valuable? I simply believe that fresh ideas are absolutely essential in bringing innovation to the city. We have a full-time staff, which remains relatively constant. Many city managers have tenures in excess of 10 years. Bringing new people onto the council assists in challenging the orthodoxy of how things are always done mindset. Long-term council members tend to internalize that status quo as right and just because they helped create it and therefore perpetuate it. Those opposed to term limits argue that if a city council member is doing a great job, then they should be allowed to re-elect them in perpetuity. I understand this argument, but I simply don't subscribe to it. For me, the benefits of term limits outweighs any negatives. Going back to Brea's recent city council conversations on the matter, when Steve Vargas first proposed a discussion a few months ago, I sincerely felt that there was ample time for the council to have a robust debate and put a measure before the voters. I believe there was 5 meetings in between that time, with 2-week intervals. Some argued that the matter was being rushed, and I won't waste time arguing that now. It's pointless. It is clear now that the council will not, and probably cannot, craft a measure for voter consideration this November. Now we need to look forward. My proposal is for the city to hit the pause button on the debate until January. I'd like to urge that the city council form, for lack of a better term, a governance committee to work throughout 2017 on term limits as well as other potential reforms. For example, campaign finance limits goes part and parcel with term limits. Brea is also in the minority of OC cities without any campaign finance limits. Again, this may not have been a problem that needed solving 15 years ago, but just take a look at single source contributions over the last few cycles and you will see $2,500, $4,000, even $9,000 contributions from certain individuals, me being one of them. Well, I gotta be honest about it. After 100 years of basically the same form of government, perhaps this committee could examine term limits, campaign finance limits, even district elections, the elected city treasurer position, and maybe becoming a charter city in order to implement any of these. My suggestion, to be really wonky about it, is a committee of 2 council members and 5 appointees, probably from a raffle to avoid political allegiance. I've long supported term limits and have privately urged members of the city council to start this debate for 10 years. In fact, when I was on the Anaheim Planning Commission in 2003, then Mayor Kurt Pringle proposed term limits for commission appointments. I stood up in front of the city council, even though I was on the planning commission, and publicly supported that. Thank you for asking me to participate, and I look forward to hearing from the panel and the audience.
Well, I believe it's a good thing that I can modify my remarks because I would echo a few of the points that were just previously made. However, I would list myself as a longtime supporter of term limits. At the same time, I will say that I wish they weren't necessary. And in theory, they wouldn't be necessary. But in a pragmatic way, standing back and looking at it, long ago, before I ran for elective office, before I worked for elected officials, and all throughout, I've been a steady supporter of term limits as a necessary forcible turnout to make our electoral system more healthy. It's more than a bit arrogant to think that in a county such as Orange County, with the huge population that we have here, that only a handful of individuals are uniquely qualified to serve in elective office. And to me, the bad part of enacting term limits means that on occasion you do turn out some office holder who really is very commendable, who's doing a really good job. The way our system is designed, I believe those people should move to higher office. And just as our economy was established, a free market economy, I believe a competitive system really improves the breed over time. So I'm not someone that normally supports regulation. I really do believe in freedom and free markets, and I know the opponents of term limits like to argue that it takes away their right to vote for someone who they would choose to vote for, and their right to, and the person who is the elected official, their right to continue to hold office. I don't really see holding elective office as personal property in that way. So I would discount the elected official's claim on perpetual ability to hang on to an office. Secondarily, although I think it is unfortunate if you have a good elected official that you may not be able to re-elect them term after term after term, I do believe that they would be more than welcome in attempting for other elective office. So I see those offsets occurring. You know, back in ancient Greece, the cradle of our democracy, there were in effect town councils, which often, or city councils, which were drawn by lot from the citizenry. Usually 400 or 500 citizens would be tasked with operating the affairs of the city for 1 year. So they were held to a single-year term limit. And as democracy progressed over time, even in early colonial America, 100 years before the Revolution, it was typical for 1-year terms to be implemented in terms of allowing those to be entrusted with the very high responsibility of making decisions on behalf of all of us. So I do see elective office as a public trust. I don't see it as personal property. I got involved on this issue in a material way 20 years ago. It was in 1996 when I was proponent and wrote the ballot arguments for term limits for Orange County supervisors. And this was circa the Orange County bankruptcy. And one of the arguments that I used that I wrote on the rebuttal argument was that even the President of the United States and the Governor of California are limited to 2 4-year terms in office. Why should Orange County supervisors serve perpetually, considering that limitation? I also said there are at least $1.7 billion, or 1.7 billion reasons for term limits, and that was the $1.7 billion loss. It is a bit, this is really a panel discussion, but it's a little bit of a debate too. I much prefer debate. But I must concede it's a very unfair debate. It's a little like shooting fish in a barrel. Because there's the other side too, and I bear the slings and arrows of the other side of this argument as well, is an elected official. We in California and in current day America, we have severe distrust in our political system. We have concerns about collusion in the upper echelons of both parties. We really don't have that competitive market which is necessary to keep our system healthy. And I believe that term limits are a type of a pressure relief valve, and that voters like to utilize it as a none of the above option as well. And that's a shame, because I think it does adversely affect commendable public servants. One of the other arguments in favor of term limits, and there have been studies conducted, recent studies, that the longer that someone serves in elective office, and the Founding Fathers knew this well as well, the idea that they would allow someone to have the public trust, serve in office, but then those people needed to return back to their private lives and live under the laws that were promulgated during their reign. The longer that someone is in elective office and does have that power and that authority, the more they're likely to see the world the same way that a career bureaucrat sees the world. And in modern day California in particular, so public employee union driven and controlled, it's a dangerous thing. One of the reasons why I supported term limits on Orange County supervisors was if the concept was you were only going to serve 8 years maximum, then it's not really a career and you shouldn't really qualify for pensions. I was also involved as a plaintiff on the effort. I worked with Paul Jacobs of U.S. Term Limits to help defend term limits that were applied on California legislature for some of the same reasons. And one of the reasons was we did make them ineligible for pensions because, again, they're serving as public service for a limited amount of time. So I just see far too many pragmatic advantages for having a forcible turnout. And I rue the damage for good public elected officials, but they do have other avenues. So I feel very confident. I've never really wavered in my solid support for term limits.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I recently authored an amendment to the ordinance that I learned today. I probably should have known that Bruce authored. I was a citizen of Fullerton, and I supported the measure back in the 90s. And I just thought tonight, as opposed to debating, really, my thoughtful process is more of an analysis. Why and how? What should we do and why should we do it? And I think it starts with really a respect that every community is distinct. I've always been a believer that local communities know what's best for themselves and they should vote. Don't fear the people's participation. So you really have a separation between what should the outcome of the election be? There's that debate. And then, well, should you even put it on the ballot? You know, I understand that everything costs money. It's not free to put things on the ballot, but who's kidding who? There is going to be an election in, you know, November's every 4 years, and then you have your primaries. So, you know, people should be thoughtful, Brea or any other community. You know, the time to put things on the ballot is certainly if you can do it when you already have items on the ballot. It's just less expensive. But when you look at term limits, I can just tell you I've lived through term limits and supported them. And I've learned a little bit doing it. I ran a law firm as a career, and I've been supportive of term limits. And what I found when I was on the Fullerton City Council the last decade is, for the most part, not everybody is a duck to water. Some people have a lot more involvement when they get to politics. I was a litigator for a living. Whether I was good or bad at it, I was a professional debater with a doctorate in rules and procedure. It should be natural to me. I felt like it was. I hope it looked like it was. But I've served with people that came out of careers where that was not what they were familiar with, and it took them a while to get going. I've also served with people, in some cases, that had been on the city council, at least in the circumstance of Fullerton, for an extraordinary period of time. And naming names is not necessary, but I think what you find sometimes is people have their own reasons for running, but I think, at least in my experience, some of the initiative had been lost. And when I got to my second term on the Fullerton City Council, we brought up the idea of should there be a term limit? And that's a legitimate discussion on its own. Yes or no? I mean, do we really believe we should have one? But there's a second part of that, which is, if so, what should it be? You know, should it be 1 year? Probably not. But you know, is 8 years the right number? 12, 16, and we tend to go in 4-year increments. And my limited experience says a few things. I've learned to lose with dignity on the AQMD board. There's not a perfect answer, right? There isn't. My experience is, for many people, 8 years is a bit tight because they don't hit the ground running. And I've experienced a number of people that turned out to be fairly decent at what they did, but the first couple of years were a struggle. And I left Fullerton after just over 8, but I felt that if I'd served out my natural term, because I'd served a partial term when I first got there, I would have been at about 10. And it really seems, in my experience, that 12 is sort of an appropriate compromise. 16 seems a little long in most cases. But if you're going to have them at all, I mean, that's sort of where I fell. What I've seen on the Orange County Board of Supervisors, and you know, Bruce penned the ordinance, I was in favor of it and had always been. But what I'm realizing on that board in particular is we do have a sort of a cycle of people that don't seem to want to go back and do whatever they're doing. And you've got this state legislature with a term limit. It's a little different now. They've now gone to 12 years. They used to have different limits. But the point is, I think people believe in a limit being a lifetime limit. Now, that's my perception, and it's an educated perception, but it doesn't mean it's right. I think when people voted in Orange County for a term limit, it didn't dawn on them that you'd have young people running, moving on, and coming back, because I think many people picture folks running for those offices when they're a little more advanced in their careers. And I'm experiencing right now, we have one of our supervisors who's on lap 2, but we also have, excuse me, one of the supervisors who has left but has $275,000 in an account to return. And I see what that does to one of my colleagues in his first term, with the specter that this person, you know, is just sort of holding it over their head that they, you know, they very well could come back. And now I'm seeing it in another seat where one of the supervisors had left. I'm not comfortable with that. That's why I proposed what I would call my fix. It's a lifetime limit, and the compromise was 12 years. And I don't know that is better than 8 or 16. It feels like it to somebody that sat through it and seen how the terms work. I would just hope that for Brea or any community, I think an innovative approach, if you're going to put the question to the people, is don't force them into a conclusion. If I were going to write a ballot argument, or excuse me, if I was gonna write the ballot question, having been a litigator, if any of you served on jury duty, a lot of times you get a questionnaire, it's not just, I find for the plaintiff or defendant. It's, you go through a questionnaire, and I think an innovative way to do it would be to have a multi-part question, really probably 3, which is, should Brea have term limits, or Orange County, or Winter Park, or, fill in the blank? Yes or no? What should the term be? 4, 8, 16, 12? I mean, I'm just suggesting, but your community is gonna answer that question. But I think it gives people an opportunity to think more about the question than I'm all in or I'm all out. And then finally, should this be? Should this be for life or not? Maybe, I'm making it up clearly, but perhaps the people that think the shorter term is better don't feel it should be a lifetime ban. I would like to believe that someone that thinks 16 years is the appropriate term might think more that should be all in. But it's a way to find out. It's a way to actually let the people make a decision that requires them to do more than just check a box. You actually have to think about it. And what I would want for any community, and I do serve Brea, I hope I do a good job, but I think communities should have these discussions. And if at the end of the day the answer is, no, we don't like term limits, that's a legitimate outcome, totally appropriate. But it's an outcome that is really worth debate and discussion, and I think you'll find in a community that it's going to cause people to consider why yes or no, because if you have to answer more than just one question, you don't get the intellectual lazy ability to check one box and be done with it. You actually have to think about it. And we do struggle with low voter turnout, obviously, and that has an effect on outcomes. But I'm anxious to participate in any of the questions, but I just in summary, I think term limits do have a benefit. They're not a perfect panacea, and there's no question there are people, because Bruce and I both worked with Chris Norby at various levels, that is a staunch opponent of term limits and ran for a long time, and as best I could tell, was enthusiastic till the day he got off the Fullerton City Council after I think 18 years, or perhaps longer. But so a unique circumstance, and a friend of mine to this day, and somebody I admire. So that was a rare bit of energy, but it was real. And I voted for Chris every chance I had, and including this last election. He didn't win. But because I know him to be enthusiastic despite a long term of service. I don't know that I'd have that much enthusiasm after 10 years, let alone 18, but he did. And so people certainly change the discussion, some more appropriate than others, but communities do need to choose, and I think Brea should tackle the question. Dodging the question just, I think, leaves a lot of tension. It's the idea that, well, we shouldn't even have the discussion does kind of avoid the issue. If it's a real issue, and it is, get the debate out in the public square to the extent people will have it, put it on the ballot, and thoughtfully go through it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so to manage the camera and the Q&A, I'll be doing it from here. Does anyone want to start out with a question or comment?
I'd like to see if we can go through the panelists and see if they, now that they've heard the other people's presentations, if they've, any of their position has changed, or if they have anything to add. Like starting with Ms. Russell.
I have not changed. I would say that Mr. Koos was talking about 15 years that we had 2 people, or 3 people, and I believe that's closer to 24 years. That Bev Perry served from 1992 to 2004, Marty 1996 to current, and Roy Moore 1998 to 2014.
Oh, I apologize if I misspoke. 15 years ago would have been, what, 2001?
Mm-hmm.
So Bev served to 2004. I was counting her as part of.
Yeah, but she started in 1992.
Okay, I'll consider that.
And then the other question I would like to know is, we don't have pensions here, and like I said, a $680 stipend. Do Fullerton have
We voted it out, Measure T.
the
The
Brea
pensions.
did.
Right, but I mean, do you have
Employee pension?
pension, but do you
No,
pay
we-
your council
we don't
people
pay.
more than
$750
$680?
a month.
Do they get their health plan paid? Because they used to pay it here at Brea.
It's still an option. I don't take it, but, and in fact, I chose not to take pension credit as well. That is still available.
So
Fullerton.
Fullerton, so.
But I think it follows that if you have longer terms, that those things start to become more viable for any elected body, certainly.
And if you're also a public employee in some respect, it affects PERS calculations, right? Pretty good, greatly in terms of the years of service, I think.
No,
No, it doesn't?
it did, it was.
It used to, okay.
It was fixed. We
Okay.
have guys like Bruce that were on this issue a long time ago. No, but I mean, in fairness,
Yeah.
the city council thing, it was a 94 case. There's no
Okay.
transferable credits for that. There once was.
I mean, to answer your question, I mean, and I haven't been specific on anything that I support in terms of a scenario, like 8, 12, 14, whatever. After reading the newspaper article and thinking about this topic for a long time, I think that Supervisor Nelson's proposal resonates with me because of the issue of this revolving door. He didn't name any names, I won't name any names, but you've seen that over the last 20 years in the county where you had, I can count at least 3 or 4, maybe 5 in the last 20 years that have gone back to up and down from Sacramento. And it's just, and even in some situations, we would jump over to a school board and then come back. I mean, it's this, and so the intent, I think, of the voters, to your point, wasn't that. And so I think that's a really effective thing. And then by default, I'm normally a fan of 8. I think Anaheim, the way Anaheim does it is something I've always been in favor of, which is it's really 10. If you get appointed to a vacancy with less than 2 years to go, it won't count as a term, but if you have more than 2 years to go, it's a term. But, you know, I mean, this, a 12-year option, regardless of when you're appointed to a vacancy, makes sense to me. Or even if you know, say you lost re-election, you came back 6 years later and you ran it, you know, your clock starts ticking again. So I think that's a really reasonable way to handle this.
And districts is going to make this interesting as well, as that issue creeps around cities. One of the cities that I serve, not this one and not Fullerton, has initiated term limits, has no districts, and essentially everyone on the council that got off got back on. I mean, just, you know, sort of a mind blower that, you know, I'm pretty sure this wasn't what the voters had in mind. Districts will change that because what was happening is people would get off and then 2 years, not 4 years later, they were running again. You wouldn't be able to do that if your city had districts because there'd be someone filling that spot. So that's going to change the dynamics a little bit going forward.
Back in,
You don't have one?
back in 1996, when we were contemplating, you know, the ballot measure, which we had urged the board at that time to put it on the ballot, and they did so. They were in a bit of retreat at the time. But the arguments were made about experience in office. And of course, that bankruptcy happened on their watch, and you had 5, only one of the supervisors was relatively new at the time. You had very long-term supervisors in those seats. And I remember Harriet Whitaker was one of those supervisors. And when it was announced during a meeting that the county had declared bankruptcy, because that was decided by staff, not by county, at a secret meeting the night before, Harriet Whitaker turned and said, "Oh, are our pensions safe?" That was her first response. I will concede that we had discussed a lot the question of 8 years or 12 years. I'm not sure what the perfect answer is on that, but I know there's tremendous resistance beyond 12 years. We certainly understand. We also considered whether it should be a lifetime ban or not. And to be intellectually honest about it, what we were attempting to do was break the cycle of incumbency, the natural incumbent advantage, that we wanted a forcible turnout, but that we weren't going to deny the voters if they had a representative they want, they're willing to elect them back in again, they could elect them back in without incumbency. Now, what was unforeseen at the time was the musical chair, revolving chair effect with the state legislature and term limits, which has created this musical chairs effect that has occurred. But that's, I'm a real strong proponent, I just want to share this, and I'm glad your question included this. Was there anything that you left out? I jotted it down just to make sure that I got it correct. But William F. Buckley, Jr., he was famous for this quote: "I'd rather entrust the government of the United States of America to the first 400 people listed in the Boston telephone book than to the faculty of Harvard University." And this is a fellow who is very proud as a Harvard graduate. I think it shows the nature, the unique nature of the American democracy, which is we want the citizens in charge, and we want the citizen legislature. We want people to go and serve honorably and not to cash in and then return to private life. And the founding fathers they're turning in their graves now, I think, with the notion that you'd have career politicians serving perpetually, cashing in, amassing power, and playing the system. I think that that would be a very antithetical idea for them. I know locally, John Ferraro is probably the longest serving council member mayor in this region, City of Industry, served 39 years there. Now, the City of Industry is a kind of rare thing anyway. But back to that earlier study, studies are showing that after 8 years or so, people in office tend to view the world more from the inside. And as representatives of the people, they start representing the inside interests against the people as a general rule. There are exceptions. And to me, that's the real danger, and that's why the forcible turnout needs to happen.
Any thoughts? We're good? All right. You go here.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. One I'd like to address to Christine Russell. You spoke of people having ungrateful constituencies, and I would ask you to explain what you think is the appropriate thing for a constituent. What is the correct attitude for a constituent?
Well, what I was meaning is that there's sometimes very angry people that come to council meetings. And when you're serving, basically as a volunteer, I mean, $680 a month isn't that much, that you're putting up with a lot of crap. And I believe that those people who are volunteering their time, they don't get a lot of kudos all the time. So that's what I mean.
Okay, well, I would point out that they're making the choice to run for that office,
Well, of course.
choosing that with their eyes wide open. So I would ask you again, what is the appropriate attitude for a constituent?
I'm sorry, I don't really understand. I mean,
Well, you mentioned that council people had, or local officials or other officials had to put up with ungrateful constituents. And that is the reason why that they should not have term limits. And so I'm asking you, what is the correct attitude for a constituent?
I'm saying that those who serve as a volunteer, basically, are for serving at $680 a month, that, yes, they have chosen this because they have a calling on their life. I mean, I believe that. My dad chose to serve for a period of time. And I remember when time that he had very unhappy constituents. I think people serve because, especially in the city of Brea, because they know each other, that they're not serving to make people unhappy. They're trying to do things, good things for the city. But there are unhappy people. Madrona was a situation where there was a lot of unhappy people. It happens, but I don't know what you're trying to get from it.
Thank you. You explained what you meant to me. I would also point out that elected officials, all sorts of elected officials, rely on their staff very heavily. And I've heard that argument advanced against term limits, that saying that if you have newbies come in, it will mean that the bureaucratic people will have more power. But the reality is the staff is relied on all levels of elected government. People may come in with oratorial skills or debating skills, but in terms of policy recommendations and how government functions, that is a universal thing that staff has relied upon. So I would like to put that out there as an argument against, to discourage this thought that term limits somehow make people more dependent on staff. It's just a bogus idea.
May
I'll
I
just say you have to
respond
speak up
quickly?
when we have the air conditioning on, unless we want to have 90-degree
May
rooms.
I respond quickly to that last comment?
Please,
Because
please.
I have been that staffer, and I have seen the process from each side, especially as an activist. And I believe it is true that often electeds do rely tremendously on staff. And so the argument about whether you've elected the right person or not, I think is really what is the crux here. Those who oppose term limits say that these jobs are extremely complex, and there's a learning curve necessary, and it might take 2 or 4, I've even heard 6 or 8 years to learn the job. Let me say my opinion, a very strong opinion. If it takes 4, 6, or 8 years to learn the job, I submit that you've hired the wrong person. In many cases, there are great responsibilities that go with these jobs, even city council, even though the pay certainly isn't equivalent with it. And we don't want people, we don't want to pay for people's inexperience or their training on the job. And I would submit that people who are less capable are much more susceptible to the influences of that career staff. So we really need people who are executives, who come from business, who are professionals, who are able to deal in a boardroom climate, and who are able to understand complex issues that it's not rocket science, and it really isn't. Government fund accounting is not rocket science either. So that notion that somehow we need to accommodate that learning curve, as a voter, I reject that completely.
Well, and I will say, I have a staff that serves me, and then have sort of the broader county staff, over 18,000 people. But, understand that what Bruce said is exactly right, with a twist. We shouldn't be paying for people's inexperience. And I'm not here to throw stones in my glass house, but I assure you, we do often. And that is part of the problem. And maybe it's because of social media. Let's face it. If you're going to run for office in today's day and age and expect that you're not going to get a lot of, sort of anonymous attacks and things, the world has gotten a lot different than it was even as I was, becoming, of age in the 90s, running my law firm. And when I got into this, it was a different world in 2001 when I ran the first time. But I think one of the comments about staff that you will find is not the rank and file, but if you hire, the more complicated a person's life was that you elected, the more they ran in the world, I assure you, the less they want to hear staff's opinion. They're used to running things and doing it themselves. We don't elect very many people that do that, by the way. Most of the people that run a lot of important things in the world aren't going to run for local office for a variety of reasons I could bore you with. But it's rare that someone that has extraordinary responsibility is really going to go out and run for city council. They're not going to put up with this stuff. The other side of it is, though, it's the staff can wait you out. If you're on a short-term limit and someone like Bruce, who is well-spoken, willing to take on tough issues, and he's adverse to staff, I guarantee you if there's an important issue that they can burn 2 more years and he's going to term out, they'll do it. That's the part about staff running the show. They'll pick and choose when and how they introduce items because tick-tock, tick-tock, this guy's going to be out of here. Let's just move this item until we get rid of them. Now, if it's day 1 of someone's tenure, obviously you can't push an item off 8 years. But if you're getting toward the end, certainly that comes into play.
But I would assert that for city council, in particular, that city council is who hires the city manager, which is the primary staff person, and they have the ability to fire them as well. So
Yeah, you're right in theory, it's just not
I don't think that your argument
practical.
holds water.
Well, first of all, that's not really a question, it's a statement, but understand, you're right. But don't be naive and think it works that way. The city councils don't fire city managers on a monthly basis, because then you'd have total chaos in your city also. City managers, I'm sure like anyone at times deserve to be fired, but the reality is if you look around, Brea, Buena Park, Laguna Woods, how often does it really come down to the point where people fire the city manager? It's pretty rare, and it's not because elected officials don't have opinions and disagreements. That's that's an appropriate remedy, but it's an extreme remedy.
Well, I have done research and most
Maybe you don't
city
have to defend
managers
yourself,
don't
you're
work
just
more
making a
than
statement.
don't stay in one place more than 3 years, so.
All right, we'll move on. Rick?
Councilman Whitaker said something that triggered a thought, and I'll really open this up to all of you if you have a position to respond to, and that was, you said that the turnout allows people to move on to higher office, that would be a normal practice. And the question that occurred to me is, to coin a phrase, a stepping stone syndrome, where people come in and take a position at, let's say, a council level with very little interest beyond that, providing them with the momentum to seek a supervisor's position or something else higher up. And what do you see as problematic by that?
Well, I do see problems with it, but that happens with or without a term limit environment. That's a standard. People run for office for different reasons, and some are looking to climb to higher office. They'll start at school boards or whatever. But as an example, I've always been a fan of Tom McClintock. And Tom McClintock in the legislature and the assembly as senator, now as congressman, is that type person who I think accurately represents the people's interests. He's not real popular to the insiders, and he's been able to climb the ladder politically. In the end, I think we're all faked out by our political system. We think it's about money, because the industry that gets people elected, it's all about money. And if you can amass the money, you win the election. I think there's a bit of a psych out there. In the end, it's about votes. And when the system we're running right now benefits the few to the detriment of the many, I always talk to the many and I say, look, if we can just set aside our differences, we outnumber them. We can basically get citizen legislators elected to these offices. But it really requires the candidates running for office to have the faith that it doesn't take big money or you know, a blizzard of mailers to get someone elected. I think a lot of that is really hooey, personally.
Please, no, continue.
Well, I'd like to speak to that because I have a list of those who've served over 8 years in Brea. And let's see, Lynn Docker went, she didn't serve, she served 8 years. But the only other person, in fact, Roy Moore, Marty, Bev Perry, Carrie Nelson, Sam Cooper, Donald Fox, Sam Magnus, Roy Monroe, Hugh Jones, W.D. Schaffer, going back to the 30s and 40s, none of them served. None of them stepped up. They liked Brea. And that's the difference between maybe Fullerton and some of the bigger cities is that, and I know personally my dad, I asked him, why didn't he keep going? And he said, and this is what he said, because I would have to compromise my ethics if I went to higher office. And this was in 1958. So there are people in Brea that want to serve Brea and Brea only. And so I don't think that stepping stone is correct.
Well, there was Bev Perry that did a lot in regional government pretty successfully. There's Todd Spitzer, the school board from Brea as well.
Right,
So
but she
there's
didn't
Marty
go
back here who's been serving for a long time and has taken shots at higher office as well.
And that you brought it up one time, and I am going to tell you, the best thing that happened in my life was not going to higher office. Because I got to enjoy my grandkids, I got to enjoy my friends, I got to go away with weekends or go on vacation with my wife and go out of town for 2 weeks and not have to worry about it. So actually, what Christie just brought up is absolutely correct. I love serving Brea, I'm glad I'm a part of Brea, and I have no desire to move anywhere. You're safe, Shawn.
I'm moving on.
I think we had a question in the back. Yeah, Dwight? Yeah. Or you want to go?
Mine's just a very quick comment. I think when Ron Garcia ran, he spent $50,000 on his, at least that's what I recall looking at the statements. But the person I admired the most, I think, about his ability to win was had a budget of $500. And he won for, how long did Brad Moore serve?
16 years.
His secret was walking and knocking on every door in the city. and $500 worth of signs. I guess it works.
Amen to that. There are different ways. Right?
Wait,
A few comments. It feels like we're talking about two parallel worlds in the federal government, the state government, and county government, and then our city. And we're talking about taking a medicine or a solution or a pill for Brea at a community level for a disorder or a malady for something at a different level that's affecting everywhere. The self-enrichment at the federal level, the Clintons are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Power, you guys talked about the politicians were not all about the money, that was sort of a fake out. They really are for power, and it festers once they get elected. But John Koos said the discussion should include campaign reform. And I'm wondering, just like in races, that they level out the playing fields for the cars so that they're restricted on what they can, on how they can perform. Why are we not discussing campaign limits of some amount and taking away the supposed, what you guys said was the advantage of incumbency, getting a lot of money donated? A couple of comments about, Bruce made a comment that it's arrogant to think that there are only a handful of qualified people. I don't think anybody in Brea thinks that. The reality is only a handful want to or will. Unfortunately, same thing with the low voter turnout. That's just part of society, and it's worse now than ever because it's harder to survive. It's harder for people to pay their rent, get gas, have their kids in school. This is a volunteer position, essentially. It is not like those higher levels where you have pensions or payoffs or cushy jobs waiting for you in Brea. A lot of times, private industry, myself included, comments, if we were running that, it would be a lot better. If we were doing this, it would be more efficient. Well, in the private industry universe, a Warren Buffett doesn't have a term limit. He's measured by his success. And to keep the voting power in Brea on your success or your track record, that seems like something that'd be the last thing I want to give up as an American with a voting right. And I'd rather take the step of, okay, let's restrict the amount of money. We have 2 council members here that are probably the highest ever to receive individual donations. $25,000 from one person, and you're in the teens, 1 donation. If that's an impediment to somebody coming forward in the $1,000 or $2,000 or having grassroots, let's restrict that. Let's look at that and say, okay, let's take this as a step to leveling the playing field. And if we have a problem in this community where something funky is happening, we can address that at that time with the term limits. Thank you.
Well, that's why, I mean, I along with term limits, I firmly believe we need campaign finance reform.
What?
I firmly believe we need campaign finance limits in Brea. I totally agree.
Along with only, they have to go together?
No, they're separate issues, but I believe in both. I believe in both.
Why do you believe in it for Brea? Nobody can tell me what our problem is that's trying to be solved.
You just said you believe in campaign finance limits, and I agree with you.
Leveling the playing field. But what about you said with term limits?
I believe in both.
Why do you believe term limits for Brea is important? What is wrong?
As I stated, I just simply believe that the democracy is best served with limited terms and rotation. I believe that's what, it's closer to the people. I've seen actually in cities that actually have them, that the final term of a council member, when they're termed out, they're more energetic and less inclined to vote in a way that they think is directly related to their re-election as opposed to what they believe is right. So I just believe that.
So the 7 personal pronouns, I, he, she, we, you, it, they. Let's say Marty. Let's use a name and speak only for Brea, because I only care about Brea. is he lost energy or something wrong with him? Because I don't see that. If I did, I'd be the first person to say, Marty, you're running out of gas. But I didn't even see it with Roy.
May I address, so you had a question, can you hear me in the back?
Yes, sir.
So one of your questions was finance limits. And I can tell you as somebody, you know, I'm a big believer in freedom, but this is what I can share with you unequivocally. Whether it's Brea's issue or not, it will be at any moment, and there's nothing legally you can do about it, and it is the following. There is no group, no person, nobody that cares more every day, every week, every hour of every year, and it will never end, about pay, benefits, and pensions as much as your public employee unions. And I've gotten along with them at times, and not so much at times. And usually when I didn't get along, it was because I was honest and I could add. And I just promise you one thing, you cannot legally limit their ability to speak, and they will make eunuchs out of your public officials if they find themselves needing to defend the city, and it's a position adverse to the unions, because they have no limits, and they have the ultimate captured audience that cares about every outcome. And as you know, you're unique that you've come here tonight. Most of your citizens are busy raising their children and trying to keep up with family and friends they don't have enough time for already. They don't have the time or the energy to spend, but the public employee unions, it's a constant. They always care. They never relent. It's never over. And if you have campaign finance reform, because we do at the county of Orange, and this is an example, but it's all over. The unions in the county of Orange spent $1.2 million opposing me, right? Because I could speak English, make correct sentences, and I could add, and we had a problem. And really that was it. I won. I fortunately had the ability to spend some of my own money. I'll never know if I needed to, because I did, and I won. I'm glad I won. Maybe I would have won if I hadn't spent the money. That's possible. But with that intimidation, there were very few people in my position. And I'm fortunate, I guess, that I was in that position. But I stood up, and I felt I needed to at the time. This was before the governor and others thought that pensions were out of control, and I'd taken a stand against the increasing costs. But the point is, no one can compete with that in the county because you have limits. So they, on a dime, can drop $500,000. We're limited, and it is a huge disadvantage, and the unions love it, and they'd like it to be a bigger disadvantage. So be careful. You think you're evening it up amongst candidates, but it's the citizens versus the unions. Not always, but when it comes down to that, if you have a campaign finance limit, you are at a huge disadvantage, and you can never fix it. Because they legally have won the day. You cannot silence them and stop them. And certainly not in California, but you can't anywhere.
What cities has the union gone in and spent $500,000 though? Down below, you know, you're at county level, I understand, you're a target.
Well, it's all relative, sir, so just take the proportions down. In Brea, $100,000 would be big, they could spend $300,000. So I mean, it's all proportional, right? I mean, you wouldn't need to spend $1.2 million in Brea, I mean, you literally...
What city have they gone into to take out a council person or people?
Sir, you must be kidding.
What, around here?
Is there a city that they haven't?
Fullerton
We're
Police.
here, I haven't seen it here.
Costa Mesa.
Fullerton Police and Fire Unions spend $80,000 to $100,000 against me when I run each time. About 4 times what my campaign spends.
Have you, any of you that are elected officers, do you have any PACs supporting you?
Yeah, I have.
Mr. Nelson, yeah, and what PAC would that be?
Oh boy, I all kinds of PACs. I mean, you've got.
So what's the difference between the PAC supporting you and the union supporting someone else?
Great question. If the PACs could spend an unlimited amount of money on me, I wouldn't have said all the things I just said. But I have campaign finance limits, so they can only give me max $1,900. A union could spend $190,000, no limit.
Directly to you, but they could advertise and that would not go to you.
Yes, that's
Yes.
theoretically possible. They could.
Unlimited.
Right, I mean, that's not
So
controlled by
the
candidates.
The reality is, a PAC can advertise for you an unlimited amount of money, just as a union can for somebody else. Yes.
Okay.
I oppose campaign contribution limits, and I'll explain the reasons, but I just wanted to thank Supervisor Nelson for saying kind words about my former boss, Chris Norby. I worked with him for 7 years at the county as he is supervisor. I worked for 3 years at the state assembly with him. He was a school teacher, not a wealthy person, but he was able to work with and be in contact with his constituents, get smaller donations, and be fairly successful in his attempts at elective office. My reasons for not supporting campaign finance limits is there's never been one designed yet that works without having loopholes the size of trucks to run through or around. I'm a believer in scientific method, and if someone can show me an example of one that works and is equitable, I might take a close look at it. Otherwise, as I said earlier, money isn't the only thing speaking in elections, and sometimes it can cut back the other way. On the Measure R election, which was the bankruptcy sales tax after the County of Orange bankruptcy, I met with Gary Hunt, the vice president of the Irvine Company, at his request. And he said, Bruce, he said, you know, we spent a couple $1 million. I have a feeling we could have spent $1 million or $2 million more and it wouldn't have made a difference. They outspent us 30-1 in that campaign. But because of those large donors and the disclosure requirements, it's very clear who you're battling on the ballot. It can cut the other direction. That the Irvine Company held back an extra $1 million or $2 million because they knew it would be counterproductive. So I told Gary, I said, I agree with you, Gary, but thanks for purchasing us a mandate. And we weren't able to fully consolidate that on the back end, but money cuts both ways. It is a political weapon. Now, there are those who want to say money is evil and will corrupt anybody in the election process. No, I agree that you need to meet fire with fire. You have to find some ability to at least be competitive when the opponents are throwing big money at you. But nowadays, with the internet, with disclosure requirements and everything, I think the real enemy here is not the money, it's the awareness of voters and their ability to get key information.
All right, we had a question here and then we'll go here.
I'd just like to say something. First of all, when we talk about the founding fathers being in favor of term limits, they never initiated any term limits. The President of the United States was Dwight Eisenhower, because of Dwight Eisenhower, and the Democrats now wanting to have him get a third term, and that was long after the founding fathers were gone. But what?
Before you go, are you moving on to another point? Before I go on, I think I stated, and I'll state it again, that they probably didn't need to because of the tradition of this being a temporary service obligation that they had.
Well, but that's true, but I don't.
But they did talk about it in a number.
Yeah, they did, but
Okay.
I don't believe that the founding fathers
Fair
instilled.
point. I concede to that.
They didn't. But anyway, one of the things that I'm concerned about is, here in Brea, I think that I thought that what we were trying to do was to set up a situation where we could discuss and debate whether we wanted to have term limits here. And I don't know that anybody in this room feels that they have the answer. I think we need to go out to the public and speak to the public and get the public's input on what's going on and in terms of their thinking of term limits. To sit here and debate whether term limits are good or bad or indifferent, or whether at the county level they're good or bad or indifferent, and with all due respect to Supervisor Nelson, I felt that the only reason that we are even talking about this is that one of our members of our council wanted to push through a term limits initiative to put on the ballot without any discussion with the people of Brea. I don't know where I stand on term limits. Some places I feel are good and sometimes I think they're bad, but in some instances. But I would like to us to get back down to what we really want to do, and that's to look at all sides of this issue and make a decision as to whether we want to have term limits on the ballot and then let the people decide. But, you know, I don't think we can be debating it here, or should be debating it here without having input from the entire community. And by the way, and I'm making a shameful plug, we have a group, a committee here in Brea called the Brea Envisions. And I have to tell you, we've gotten feedback from this community that you wouldn't believe. People in this community really love this community. People in this community work hard for it, to keep it the way it is. And I can guarantee that if we go out to the public in Brea and say, we want to talk about term limits, we'll have a tremendous, tremendous response from the people.
I completely agree. I know you serve on Brea Visions. In fairness to Mr. Vargas, despite his petition, he did attempt to engage the council on it prior to that. Maybe it wasn't timely. I guess it probably wasn't timely. I did suggest that maybe we could tackle a number of governance issues. We're a 100-year-old city. Even Measure T could use some collaboration. Wait, oh, you can't hear me?
John, can you?
Sorry,
Yeah,
is the air conditioning? So maybe, we could have a robust discussion about governance issues. And some people have suggested maybe we look at a charter. With respect to Brea people, I heard a council member say, I think, something about Brea being different. Now, I agree Brea is different. I live in Brea. I chose to live in Brea. In fact, I came to Brea because it was so cool back in '03. I raised my children here. They go to school right around the corner over here. I love Brea. But I have no illusions that people are not people. That if we put the notion before the voters, maybe an advisory vote. I think Fullerton did an advisory vote that probably was not specific. It probably said, do you support some form of term limits in the city of Fullerton? What was the...
Early in my term, I'm in my 6th year on the council, but early there was a ballot measure advisory in nature put before the voters about term limits, suggesting a 12-year term limit. That passed very handily in Fullerton. It doesn't have the force. It doesn't have the force of law, but it is politically. It's an absolute non-starter for someone that wants to try to overturn those at this point. So that's the experience. At the time when I was involved running for office, I supported that measure. I didn't support it. I think that anyone who really does want to adequately serve the people isn't afraid to put measures before the people, provided they aren't misleading or overly complex, or that there's gamesmanship going on of having competing measures and trying to, in a down-ticket race in a presidential election, you can pull a lot of shenanigans, right? So as long as it's an honest, clear effort, and I like what you're saying, but whether you're for or against term limits, I would suggest there's no harm at all in putting the question before the voters, because you're trying to serve their interests.
And the council could do that probably at their next meeting if they really wanted to.
But that short circuits us, the citizens of Brea, who want to talk about it, and like Tom said, and I agree that you looking at it in January and having a year to look at it, and then putting it on when there aren't 17 state resolutions. I mean, that's going to be...
Well, there probably will always be 17 state resolutions, but, no, as I mentioned, real quick. Real quick, and I hold that we should do it the Brea Envisions kind of way and look at a number of governance issues. I didn't plan on suggesting an advisory vote, but, that would give us an indicator, and we're going to have an election anyway, because we have to, I think, affirm our city treasurer position, so that doesn't mean that we're going to run a special, basically. And I think the results would probably be fairly consistent, and I don't want to commit sacrilege and say Brea is just like everywhere else, but when you see, statistics are pretty, compelling. I mean, Buena Park, 81%, Costa Mesa, 80, Dana Point, 83. I can go on and on. So all the cities that passed them, we're talking 75% and above. And now, I do agree that if you put a not so ideal one before the voters, they'll probably pass that too, and we don't want to do that.
Right, you wouldn't want to do that.
But I think an advisory vote would be real huge indicator. If only 40% of the Brea residents on an advisory vote said they wanted term limits, then I think that would be a compelling reason to end the discussion for a decade or so.
But an advisory vote would have to be overturned by a council, and that's political suicide in many cases. So it is a more permanent situation than it would seem as an advisory.
Rick had his hand up.
I think we, Scott.
Oh,
Yeah, we're like 10 minutes ago, they were
Yeah, no problem.
signaling.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you guys for all coming, for seeing everybody, that's a great deal, and thank you, Brea First, for putting this on. Question I guess I have, and when you talk back and forth about term limits, no term limits, what menu will you have? I keep hearing conversations or things like, let's put it in front of the voters. Well, I know, Mr. Whitaker, you crafted some of this stuff back in the day. So my question, I guess, to you is, and maybe Mr. Nelson, what amount of public input is needed to make this decision? Because if you just go, okay, well, let's just put one term out there and never again, they'll vote for it, you know they will. 16 and never again, they'll vote for that too. So how do you get the input? How would you go about that? Or do you just make the decision based on council or advisory committee that this is what we think the citizenry wants, and we're going to go ahead and put it on the ballot, and they're going to vote for it?
You know, as an activist or an elected official, you're always trying to divine what the voter interest is and what really is relevant and what's important to them. So it is a bit of a crapshoot whenever you're doing that. However, it should come back on you should you try to push something that really is off-center as far as what's going on. So to have any credibility, whether, again, you occupy any of those spots, you do want to put something at least that's pretty close to the mark out there. Otherwise, it may fail of its own lack of merit. And so I do think it should be approached responsibly. I think you should encourage these type forums and talk a great deal about the pros and cons of it. I believe that that's where it begins. But the people who are against term limits, they say we already have them. They're elections, they're regular elections. So you have that, and that the voters express their will in elections. That really is the power. So this is the same situation. You don't know for sure till it's out on the ballot, and the voters will decide, and will abide by whatever that decision is.
And one of the things that came up, I don't know if you were here when I made my opening remarks, but just having thought through this, and I'm proposing a kind of a county fix to a little glitch in our system. And one of the things that I thought of is if I was just called to advise a community I'd never been to, what do you think about term limits? How should we do it? Term limits are a multi-phase question. Step one is, do you think there should be term limits? But ballots can ask multi-part questions. Should there be a term limit, yes or no? And if there is a term limit, what is the right number? And maybe through community forums, I mean, maybe what you get down to is the choice is 8 or 12, which if I had to guess, probably what would be the most popular. And then the last question would be, should this be a lifetime limit or just a consecutive cap? And you have to work on the wording, but one of the things that was discussed earlier is if you put it on the ballot that way, it forces people to think through it. Because you can't just, term limits, yes, and you don't even have to read the rest or what it says or how many years it is. You actually have to engage and think, okay, maybe it should be for life, but maybe I should pick the bigger number. Maybe not, maybe it should be for life and some people would pick one, who knows. But you have a unique community that has a lot of forums to vet these things. And just as someone who serves your community and spent a lot of time here as a youth and as an adult, including my dinner on Sunday night, great new Cajun place in town, by the way. But I think a community benefits when you put these questions out there, you engage them, and give them more than just check the box as a choice. And this is one of those issues that if you did it right, you really could ask people multiple questions on the same ballot and force a little more intellectual engagement than the ballot usually requires.
I have one question. I thought that initiatives had to be specific to one issue. One had to be specific, so wouldn't you have to have 3 separate initiatives to address the different lengths of terms? How would you do a multiple choice initiative?
If you're asking me a legal question, that's not something I've done the research on. I mean, I have an understanding of it, but in concept, the idea would be a multi-part question.
So that would be an advisory measure you're talking about?
No, I mean, I think you could sort out the details, But in concept, the idea is a yes or no on term limits. And then if term limits, what would be your prescribed time? Because one of the interesting things that would do, having done a lot of jury work, is there are a lot of people that think, I voted for the other guy, therefore I don't want to participate in the rest of this. No, 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 you don't get that luxury. Question one was plaintiff or defense. Defense won. So it doesn't matter if you think the other side should have won, go to question two.
I think there's been several initiatives that have been found not been unconstitutional because they didn't address, they addressed more than one issue. So it sounds to me like that's what you're saying, is having a multiple choice initiative.
Well, it's similar to a
No,
recall.
you're talking about
Do
a
you want a
poll, and
recall?
she's talking about, should it be on the ballot to vote that way?
Right, we're all talking about the same thing. Let me just
She's on the
suggest,
ballot.
there are attorneys that specialize in this, that any competent modern city in California like Brea would engage to make sure they didn't run afoul. And look, it's not a perfect world. I mean, there's many things that people thought were legal and ultimately got overturned or picked apart. I mean, that's either good news or bad news depending on your position. But the intent should be to answer a question and to get a right answer. And I think if you're looking to nitpick, the idea is get the best answer. Not to find before you get it all the reasons that no matter what the answer is, it's got to be sort of invalid because there's a legal technicality. You have to follow the law, right? I'm a card-carrying barman. You have to follow the law, but I don't think you need to figure out the legal language today to know that in concept, just like if you make a business deal, the terms are the terms. Yeah, the lawyers are going to fight out some pretty lengthy looking documents, but your terms are your basic understanding.
Yeah, question for Christie. You mentioned a friend who had sent a questionnaire out to a number of electeds or senior people in various cities. In summary, were they generally in support of or in opposition to the idea of term limits? What has been the impact overall for those who have enacted term limits or not?
Well, it's interesting because I was looking at that. Tim Shaw of La Habra, they don't have term limits. But Jim Regenheimer, I guess, Regenheimer. And he was answering with term limits, asking if the term limits had been a benefit or hindrance, and he said both. And they said they are no panacea. And his term limits is 2 consecutive 4 years. After 2 years, you can run again. He said in the world of politics, you have good people and you want to keep them. If you have bad people, you want them gone. He says, I was a big supporter of state term limits when Willie Brown ran the state for a couple of decades. Going to a 6-year limit for Assembly and 8-year limit for the Senate has been a disaster. Nobody has experience in Sacramento. And what I'm hearing today from you guys is term limits has always been about one person or the tax or, you know, it seems that it's an issue of one thing that all of a sudden we're making a law and for, like in our aspect, 96% of the time that people run or 8 years, or not 96, but 12 years or less for 96% of the time. Why in the world do we need to get an attorney involved to make up an advisory? That's going to cost more money than the $5,900 that we've already paid. Then we put it on we don't need it. I mean, we can look at the Brea Visions, or we can look at forums that are not costly, but once we start getting involved in this, for why? Why?
Well, it's up to you and Brea to determine whether it's the right formula for you. But I will give you a couple more positive reasons for term limits. And it happened at the state legislature as well. After a few cycles, they determined that there were more females who were getting elected to the legislature. There were more minorities getting elected. because you didn't have 20 and 30-year serving
Yeah, we already have
of
that.
existing, right. But the ability in a shared democracy for more people, I mean, I feel it's an honor to represent my city on the city council. I know the two council members here feel the same way. But to the extent that more people can avail themselves of that experience over time, it really does add to our participatory democracy. And it allows people to understand, I mean, really, a shorter term would result in less gray hair for many of us up here, I believe. So I think that the idea of having those offices plugged more or less, and really the ability for a challenger to even take on a long-term incumbent, it's relatively meager ability to be able to overcome that.
I would like to know how many people are running for your offices against the incumbents.
We don't know yet, but there will be 3 incumbents up for re-election. I'm one of them. We'll probably have, I'm guessing, 8 or 9 challengers.
Well, we don't have that in Brea. I mean, in 2008, we didn't have anyone that came to run. I mean, you know, what if we term out and nobody comes? What are you gonna do then? I mean, and that,
to keep doing it.
in 2012, for 2 seats, we had 5 people. We had 6 people for 3 seats last term. So far as I know, we haven't had anybody file yet for this term.
Only the incumbents.
Only the incumbents.
Right, but there's your test. The question to ask is, when there's an open seat, how many people file?
Well, and that was, last year we had 2 open seats, or 2014.
3. Oh, 2 opens.
Well, 2 opens, 1 did, and we had a total of 6 people, and the incumbent lost.
But to Mr.
No, an incumbent can't lose an open seat. It's an
Well,
open
I'm
seat.
sorry, but
Right,
but we had a clean sweep.
There's no right
In
answer. I'm
addition-
just suggesting that, like La Habra, when every incumbent is running, that kind of answers the question. The reason no one runs is there's an assumption that these people are impossible to beat and they're just going to win again. Now, that may be a good or bad thing. I'm not even offering an opinion, but I think the fair analysis is the reason so few people run is, for good or bad, they believe there's no way to win, so they'd be wasting their time.
To Shawn Nelson's point, I mean, and I hate to use a reference from back when I was in Anaheim, but in the 2002 election, for 2 open seats, 12 people ran, 2 open seats. In the 2000 election, you know, here's some names from the past, Shawn Kraken and Tom Tate ran unopposed because they were running again. So I think that's kind of what you're talking about.
All right, yep.
You know, again, I have the last 25 years, 26 years of information. We don't have that problem. I mean, we have, you know, it just amazes me once you look at what Brea does and what has happened in Brea, of why we want to bring in all of the expense and why we want term limits for, now, again, you said 3 and 15 years, and that's incorrect, because she got off she was in 1992 to 2004, Bev Perry.
I don't want to split hairs about it. 15 years ago, she finished her 3rd term, and we've had 2 since that have served 4 and 5.
Yeah, and one of them was the one that Roy, who with Steve, thought that term limits was good.
Yes.
You know, that makes no sense. I'm sorry, but.
I have a question for Mr. Whitaker.
Oh, real quick, I'm in favor of removing limits on air conditioning.
I'm
So
sure,
we're getting more,
especially with
you
the
would
code. My question, the impression I got from what you said was that you did an advisory vote for Fullerton. Am I correct in hearing what I think that I heard?
It was really a prior council that had put that.
But
as
it
a
was an
question on
advisory vote, is that right?
It was just as I was coming on the council.
So the question I have, that if I understood what you were saying correctly, and it sounds like I did, what was the effect, once they said that they wanted it, what did you do with that advisory vote? That's what I'm trying to
As I said,
understand.
it doesn't have the force of law.
Absolutely.
Really, but it does have the political force of law.
Okay.
Because, and in fact, it is a possibility here, because I see it as having a certain permanence.
So what did it do? I mean, did it stop people
It's
from
in
having?
place, no one has challenged that, and I don't believe anyone will, because considering the sometimes 5-to-1 margins on this question, anybody who's running for council or anyone who's looking for reelection, it's a bit precarious for them to, because it would require the council to overturn that council decision. We adopted then an ordinance on it, but it's an ordinance on ourselves. It could easily be removed.
So you did adopt it, that was the part I missed.
But it wasn't an initiative by the people
I
which
got
have to
it,
be
I
overturned
got
by
it.
the
You
people.
adopted it at council.
Right. And that's a good solution, I believe, because, again, if the city really doesn't like term limits, it could be easily overturned.
But
it could at any cycle anyway.
But if you were worried, if you're truly worried about it, they could have put it up and have it ratified by the people, but they didn't do that.
Right.
Because they figured the advisory was.
But I don't see it as having any fewer fangs, really, for someone that wants to serve for a long time. I mean, it is very permanent.
All right, we'll do.
What's the best way of getting the people in the community interested to respond to the issue? It seems like, you know,
Provide dinner.
if you, yeah, well, you could do that, but let's be serious here. What if, I mean, it seems like when you have small events like this, that you get, you know, a certain collection, most of the time, those are the ones who will show up at any time. Why not do a survey, send out a written survey to everybody in the city?
Or put a Pokemon stop somewhere.
It's one of those issues, I think, that can bring people together. For the most part, back in the Measure R question, it was in the county, after the bankruptcy, it was the most debated issue in Orange County history. And there were many, there was cable television, there were town hall debates, there were many, and good media coverage. Now, we lack the media nowadays, but whatever blog-wise and whatever civic-wise that could be done, and maybe put it on local cable, I would very much encourage that.
The funny thing about this survey is that, now my Brea Matters article is even smaller without my glasses, I can't remember. I talked to Neil Kelly about the cost of adding a measure to the ballot. I think about $8,500 in addition, $8,500 in addition to what we're already in for with having city treasurer on the ballot, or city council race for that matter. Probably would go down the more things you have on the ballot. $8,500 is actually probably cheaper than doing a survey, and that's a survey. That's a survey of voters, actually, at the ballot box. So maybe that's a consideration for council, do an advisory vote.
The staff recommendation was, included a survey, which tabbed out about 50 grand if anybody were to dare to go there. But where it stood now, no decision was made, but the implication was, look, let's do what we can do for free and do ourselves first. Let's have a public forum like Brea First is tonight, but let's do it under the auspices of the city like we did for Madrona, like we did for the downtown parking structure. Let's have a night where people can come in and share with us. And if at the end of that evening, we are, as a council, are still uncertain, then let's do a survey ourselves through the various media that are available to us that can be done by staff for pennies on the dollar. We never have to get to that $50,000, outside consultant survey. We have the tools necessary to be able to do that. The point is we need to do that. To just rush to judgment and jam something in without broad public opinion, when there is no ticking time bomb, when there is no clock running, makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, I think that 50,000 figure or whatever it was a comprehensive customer satisfaction survey that they were going to throw in this topic. But I think a real survey, a reputable survey would probably be with its, statistically significant sample size. It'd be at least 8,500, probably 12.
I'm talking about a survey you stick in the water bill, and the people get it and fill it out and send it in. We don't have to.
Statistical
advisory vote would be
appropriate number here, John, is with 12 to 14,000 voters, basically you're looking for somewhere between 600 and 700 responses will give you a projectable number. And that the answers you get, if you got to 800, 1,000, or 1,200, is not going to demonstrably change the information you got at 6.
Agreed.
Less
Actually,
than that becomes suspect.
I've talked to pollsters about doing on the cheap surveys of like really low universes, and it's probably 5,000, 400 people, 500 people. But I think before we get to Dwight's question, you can take out all the mystery of confidence levels, margins of error.
Yeah.
If you just did an advisory vote, you would know exactly what the voters want. At least a general question: do you support term limits in some concept?
If the predominant majority answer on the advisory question number 1, yes or no, is no, then their subsequent responses are irrelevant, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay.
All right, we'll do the last couple questions and then answer those, and then we could do final statements, and then we're done. All right, we have Dwight.
I wanted to thank you guys for coming, everybody, and speaking and putting yourselves up there. We very much appreciate it. I wanted to take a step back and repeat what Chris said in the beginning. When Brea First was founded last year, we had a mission statement of Brea First and bullet points of things that were of key concern in the community. Term limits, campaign reform was one of those items. But number 1 as a target was defined benefit pension plans, where within 2 years, over 20 cents of every dollar at the school level and at the city level is going to go paying those pensions, so that 70-something cents is left of every dollar for all of us to live off of. Where I was here 40 years ago and 50 years ago and went to school here, where they had 100 cents of every dollar to function with. And whether you're at a city or a county or wherever, the real boogeyman in the room, and the thing that we made good progress on with Brea First was teeing that up and getting public discussion there. And I personally feel like it's been hijacked, the city's momentum has been hijacked with this subject, and it's so subjective to say it's right or wrong. Everybody's right on those opinions, because ultimately, you guys are right. A term limit is a good concept and a good thing as a backstop, because it's a catch-all, so we don't have to be micromanaging, oh my God, we got something wrong. But if we don't address the defined benefit and realize equals Ponzi, that it won't matter about term limits. We're quickly towards the edge of the cliff right now, and I respect that you did a tweak with the unions and they threw everything at you, and that's why we all have to unite and stay focused with our eye on the ball, that's the boogeyman. And whether it's short-term or long-term people, our concern is if you're elected, you're the custodian of that, you're the guardian for that. We got into this problem because elected officials let that happen, and that needs to be, I think, the focus of Brea First, the community, everybody, before we move on to other things right now. Thank you.
You don't have to respond, but if you...
It's no panacea, I agree with that. It's not a panacea. But it is one of the tools with which you maintain some level of accountability.
May I make a comment?
All right, quick comment, and we'll do the last question.
I think the thing that no one's talking about in the room is the fact people are really upset with the status quo in America, which is why we had Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump as big players up to this point. So term limits is relevant. It's going to be a big, big election turnout year. We're talking about a topic that could start at a lower level and possibly filter up, because I've talked to people about this a lot, and they've asked me whether Congress or Supreme Court may also be up for grabs on term limits. So I get why there's a lot of hesitation. It would be from the November ballot forward, 8 years beyond that. I agree with Mr. Whitaker that it doesn't hurt to put it on. We can save a lot of money by going out and talking to people. We don't necessarily have to spend $25,000 in February to do a random survey. Look at the room. There are 22 people here. and a bunch of them are special interest people, to be quite honest. And, the average citizen is not quite aware of all of the things going on, but they very much are aware of what affects their pocketbooks, their lives, and what good governance is. So it's an interesting issue. A lot of things were kicked around, but realistically, this is a charming little community. I'm kind of new, but some folks act like we're in 1955 in Missouri, and it's 2016, and we have issues here that perhaps echo out in America. So kind of keeping that perspective in play as well, that while it is Brea, it's also a microcosm of America. So.
Any question?
I just want to say, Bruce, that you were talking about women getting into elected office. Without term limits, the city of Brea now has 2 women. One is our mayor and one is our mayor pro tem. So yeah, we don't naturally fit into that category. And we've had Hispanics on our council. We have Marty, who's Armenian, and we have all kinds of different folks. And one of the things I would like to just say is that the folks that run for office, at least in Brea, and I know most of them, I know all of them actually, these are people that work really hard, and they give up an enormous amount of time. And I don't know any of them, I haven't spoken to one of them that says, I want to step up and use this as a stepping stone to some other job. I've not seen that at all. And these are, and what I love about what we have now, I can call Marty on the phone and get a hold of him and say, Marty, what do we do about this? How about that street light that's not working down at such and such? I can call Steve on the phone anytime and get a hold of him and say, hey, Steve, the sewer isn't working. And that's because they've been around, they know this city, they know how it operates. They do have staff to handle some of these problems, but they are on top of it and they know the system. Now, I'm not saying I'm for or against term limits. I'm just saying that we need to look at this and say, yeah, maybe our city is a little bit unique. We're a small little town. I was speaking to the clerk at the city of West Hollywood. It's about 30,000 people. And they went through this term limits thing. And it was a nightmare for them in a little town like that. So, let's let the people talk about it, think about it. But I agree totally with Dwight that our major problem in this city and all the cities, I'm Puerto Rican, and I have to tell you, Puerto Rico went through hell because of the pension system. And all of us in this state, and in every state in the union, by the way, have to be addressing this issue. That's the important issue. This seems to me like something that we've just sidetracked ourselves on, and I wish we would get back to those important issues.
Well, if you have any closing statements, we can go either way. We'll start. We did right to left, so we'll do left to right, I guess. Supervisor, you have any?
I would just like to say, first of all, I feel guilty I showed up on this issue, but I'd be happy to come back on the other one. But in all fairness, I just appreciate, look, communities should choose their destiny. I think it's great that you're engaging, asking people that live out of town, people with some experience in the issue, but also, your citizens that are engaged. This is what democracy is all about. I enjoy doing this and watching you people engage more than most of the things I do in the job, and it's a big menu, but this is the real part of it.
I thank you for the invitation to be here this evening, and because of the nature of it and the experience that I bring on the topic, it has been multi-layered. And we all do vote for all those other offices as well. I apologize that it wasn't strictly Brea-centric, but I think part of the reason I'm here is to bring some of that other detail, including being a sitting council member in a city that did establish term limits. So I appreciate the relevance to Brea voters. This is your issue. I would not campaign on this issue over here at all. It's strictly for Brea voters to decide. But I think all of us as voters, and understanding the connective tissue between all offices and the way that we seek accountability at every level of government, that there is value at looking I do think the one term limit experiment that is a failure to some extent is the state legislature because of that musical chair effect. And now largely they're making modifications to that, which sometimes is not as healthy as having the voters impose. It's a question again of who's in charge. It's an important message we send that the voter, that the electorate is in charge of our democracy. Thanks.
If you want to read my, first I need to thank Rick actually for allowing me to be a guest writer in his blog. I think my argument is all of it will be in perpetuity on the internet, so I won't restate that here. I also want to thank Brea First for inviting us here. And to the point about pensions, I attended that forum with great interest. So much so that I actually spoke to the speaker on the phone for about an hour about a month ago. I do believe that we can actually engage on multiple policy items at the same time, to be honest with you. But yeah, yes, in terms of true category, priority, yes, pensions are, for me too, higher than term limits. But doesn't mean we can't talk about other governance matters.
Thank you. I agree that pensions are a big problem, and hopefully we can get the county and the state engaged in it to do something. But I would like to speak that, again, in 2014, we had an election, and 2 people did not choose to run, and 1 person did run. So we have a council, again, of 3 people with 2 years. We have a council and 1 person with 4 years and 1 person with 20 years. That, that is reality. And if we put in if you go along with what you're putting in, we're looking at, 2 terms and out, or possibly because you didn't make it, and you're writing, you didn't say 2 years or 3 years, you're saying 1 appointment and 4 years and out. We do not have that many people running for office in Brea that we can wipe out good people. And that is my, we have 40,000 people and I don't know how many registered voters, but people are not volunteering like they used to. Churches, if you are a part of a church, you don't have as many volunteers as you used to. And we have to be careful that, again, like I said, we have an election and no one comes. And we've turned out people and no one comes. Or we get a level of person who really doesn't have the fire in the belly, as Colin Powell said, and someone who is not qualified to run. Let's just be careful that we don't make us a big city. We're not. We're not Fullerton. We're not the 70,000 of Yorba Linda who's having problems finding people to run. We're 40,000 people. We're a community where most of our young families are working really hard to work and do sports for their kids and stay alive. And so anyway, you can see that I'm passionate.
Well, thank you everyone for your passion.